Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. And if you and I don't do this, then you and I may well spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free.
So John, what did the Iran-Contra crisis reveal about Ronald Reagan's administration, and how did this affect his policies over the course of his presidency?
Okay, so before we talk about the crisis itself, I want to talk about the four major players. So we have Iran, the Contras, John Poindexter, and Oliver North. So Iran was technically a U.S. enemy at the time. I don't know if you remember, but there was the whole Iranian hostage crisis in which a team of Muslim student followers took over the U.S. embassy in Tehran and held the U.S. citizens there captive for over 444 days. It actually ended on January 20th, 1981, which was the first day of Ronald Reagan's presidency. Kind of a random cool fact. But in any event, because of this crisis, Iran was still a U.S. enemy at the time, and U.S.-Iranian relations were pretty tense. The Contras were a group of Nicaraguan rebels who were fighting the current socialist government. So as you know, at this time, the Cold War was at its height, and the U.S. was fighting a series of proxy wars. One of these proxy wars was in Nicaragua, where the Soviet-backed government was being fought by the U.S.-backed Contras. However, the U.S. was not legally allowed to fund the Contras because of the Bolin Amendment, which was passed after it was discovered that the Contras had committed a whole series of different crimes. They've been trafficking cocaine and just not doing the things that a rebel group that was supported by the United States government would do. So Oliver North and John Poindexter were greatly desired to fund the Contras. They really wanted to make sure that the Contras were properly funded and able to fight their war because, as we know, war is expensive. So they came up with this kind of ingenious solution. What they would do is they would sell missiles to Iran by first transporting them to Israel. So you take a shipment of missiles, you send them to Israel. So you're not sending anything directly illegal to Iran. Then the Israelis ship the missiles to Iran. Iran gives the money to the Israelis. The money comes back to the U.S. And we've now sold missiles illegally to an enemy of the state, and now we have a crap ton of money. This money was then diverted to the Contras so that the Contras were able to buy weapons, they were able to fight a war, and they were essentially able to function. So, as you can imagine, this was highly illegal. And some of the fallout was the Tower Commission was established by Ronald Reagan when it was revealed that his administration was committing all these crimes. So the Tower Commission basically concluded that Poindexter and North were solely responsible for everything. Ronald Reagan pleaded innocence the entire time, and he likely had no idea what was going on within his administration. Ronald Reagan took a very hands-off approach to governing in his first term, but Poindexter and North really took all the fall. They were actually both convicted of crimes. I think they each had about 5 counts and millions of dollars in fines, and I think one of them faced up to 25 years in prison. So these were serious punishments. But neither of them actually ever served any prison time because they received they received immunity for the testimony they gave to Congress. So the long-term effect this had on Reagan's presidency was because he had taken such a hands-off approach and such a massive scandal had been committed. Reagan really wanted to make sure something like this never happened again, so Reagan became much more heavily involved with all of the intricacies of policy and took a much more hands-on approach to foreign policy.
Okay, thank you for your insights on that. And can Ronald Reagan truly be credited with ending the Cold War?
So this is kind of a more complicated question. During the beginning of his administration, Ronald Reagan built up U.S.-Soviet tensions dramatically. He increased spending by a monstrous amount. In fact, he spent more than the previous 3 presidents combined, more on defense than the previous 3 presidents combined. He had a massive U.S. nuclear buildup. He even joked during a radio interview that we begin bombing in 5 minutes, which is kind of a scary thing when you actually have the guy who can press the button and end all life. And we came really, really close to that in 1983 during a series of NATO war games, which were so realistic that the Russians almost scrambled their jets and almost attacked attacked NATO, which would have likely caused World War III, which it turns out is really not good. So after war games, everyone kind of toned down the rhetoric a bit, including the Soviets. And Ronald Reagan became one of the first sitting presidents to meet with the Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. So that was much closer to ending the Cold War. He also helped to start the negotiations for the START 1 and 2 treaties, which were nuclear drawdown treaties. And actually, the treaty was eventually signed by Bush in 1993, though. Ronald Reagan didn't sign it, but he did get everything started. He also helped start all of the movement towards tearing down the wall. He gave a speech at the Brandenburg Gate, which, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall, that famous line. So he was very anti-Soviet, but he really wanted to end the Soviet Union. But, as much as he did, you can't take away the credit from all of the protesters who actually stood up to these oppressive governments and really fought to end the Soviet Union.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so now that we covered the foreign policies with John, I'm really curious in what you have to say about the economic policies.
Well, I think it's a great transition to go from foreign to economic policy. Now, in terms of economic policy, Reagan argued that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. When Reagan started his term, he inherited the economy during a time of stagflation, which is a term used to describe a stagnant economy, one of high unemployment and high inflation, which is actually usually unlikely to happen. As a result, Reagan proposed this 1981 Program for Economic Recovery, which he outlined in his speech, America's Economic Bill of Rights. He proposed 4 major aspects that would actually help alleviate and recover the economy from the difficulties it was undergoing. Now, the first aspect was aimed to reduce the growth of government spending. Reagan started off his presidency with a great cut in government spending. He cut domestic programs by approximately $39 billion. However, when Reagan began suggesting an increase in defense spending, as we heard from John previously, and the occurrences with the Cold War and the Berlin Wall, Reagan actually increased the defense budget by 35%. And so even though Reagan's campaign argued that he would work to reduce the government spending, Reagan's presidency actually doubled the national debt.
So what were the causes of the increased national debt?
So, as I mentioned previously, Reagan's interaction in the Cold War and his increase on defense budget definitely, correlated and allowed him to increase the total national debt. This, along with his expansion on Medicare and his increase on payroll tax, allowed his government spending to increase by 2.5% annually, and as a result, double the national debt. So if we look at his first aspect, which he argued was going to reduce the government spending, he actually didn't accomplish much in terms, as we see, actually increased rather than reduced. Now, if we go on to the second and third aspects that kind of correlate, that he outlines in his Economic Bill of Rights, that he thought was going to recover the economy, and this actually is, in my opinion, the most successful aspect of his economic policies. The second one was to reduce the marginal tax rates on income from both labor and capital, and the second was to reduce inflation, was to reduce inflation by controlling the growth of money supply. Now, Reagan followed the concept of supply-side economics, where he believed that tax cuts would result in economic expansion.
So what constitutes the difference between supply-side and demand-side economics?
So demand-side economics is the belief that the economy is driven by consumer demand, while supply-side economics is the belief that an increase in supply will result in an increased spending and therefore increased economic standing. Now, in terms of Reagan's presidency, the reason that supply-side economics worked was because tax rates were extremely high, and so tax cuts eventually allowed for economic expansion. And so now, this is why I definitely believe this was his most successful aspect of his economic policy. As we see, he was actually able to, achieve those two aspects that he argued. Now, the fourth was to reduce government regulation. And this was also deemed somewhat of a success, not extremely. He worked to continue the elimination of the Nixon-era price controls. He removed controls on oil, gas, cable, certain phone services, interstate bus service, and ocean shipping. He also had an impact on bank regulation. So even though he had an impact on bank regulation, this wasn't necessarily a good thing. Although certain acts were passed to reduce regulation, These acts actually contributed to the savings loan crisis of 1989. So even though he was known for his attempt to reduce government regulation, his attempt was not extremely successful, as we see it resulted in such a crisis. Now, this was just a brief summary of Reagan's economic policies, and to connect it to President Obama's economic policies, not in terms of their actual policies, but they entered their presidencies during a time right after a recession. And so even though they entered at very similar times, their approaches were extremely different in terms of how they responded and their actual policies themselves.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so why did the Reagan administration do little to help combat the spread of AIDS?
Reagan believed strongly in conservative values, and conservatives believe that the federal government should not intervene with everyone's daily life. They believe that the best federal government is a weak federal government. And had Reagan intervened with the AIDS epidemic, he would have been going against those values, and he would have been intervening when he believed that it was up to the states and up to the people to fix the problem, not him.
And so the war on drugs started in the Nixon administration, but why did it gain more national attention under Reagan's administration?
So when Reagan was president in the 80s, there was a big problem with crack. Crack was in neighborhoods, crack was in the cities, crack was everywhere. So Reagan believed that this was not a problem that was going to fix itself. This was a problem that needed to be addressed by the federal government.